Patrick Buchanan, currently a columnist, political analyst for MSNBC, and chairman of the American Cause Foundation, the author of 10 books, including his latest book, Suicide of a Superpower, Will America Survive to 2025? Buchanan.org is his website. Pat Buchanan, welcome back to the program.
Hi, Tom. Welcome. Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
It's been a couple of years since we talked. Before we get into a fight,
right,
let me talk with you about what we agree about.
Okay.
Which you briefly touch on in this book, but you had a large chunk of one of your earlier books devoted to. This was a book that came out 2-3 years ago. I don't remember the title,
right,
but I actually read the whole thing. And that is the insanity of these free trade policies and the fact that we have surrendered our national sovereignty to transnational corporations who are running the world, basically, and screwing American workers.
Well, Tom, when I ran in the early 90s and against President Bush about 20 years ago, I argued that if you go for free trade when we have a country with the highest wage level on earth and regulations dealing with civil rights and health and safety and the environment, nobody else does in the third world and where we're moving to, I said you'll lose every manufacturing plant in the United States. And in the last decade, we lost 55,000 manufacturing plants and 1 in every 3 manufacturing jobs in America, almost 6 million.
Yeah.
And
so here's my question. Here's my question for you. Given those statistics, I mean, you and me and Bernie Sanders are all singing the same song here, and so it's it's the whole political spectrum. Why is it that's never a conversation that I hear on not just MSNBC where you work, but also any television network, and it's not. I mean, everybody's hysterical about our budget deficit. Frankly, I think it's our trade deficit that's going to kill us.
I think you're absolutely correct. It's deindustrialized America. It's driven down the wages or taken away the best-paying jobs of blue-collar Americans and working Americans. And in these $600 and $700 billion trade deficits we were running the last decade, that's where China got its $3 trillion in cash reserves, and it's running all over the world, buying up all the resources. Why don't they discuss it? I'll tell you. The Republican Party has been converted to a free trade ideology by Milton Friedman, whom I used to follow on this issue until he told me I was doing the devil's work. And Bernie Sanders used to come on my radio show in the early 90s, and he and I and Jim Hoffa and Ralph Nader were the only guys doing battle. We were the lead guys doing battle against NAFTA along with Ross Perot.
I know. What amazes me, I believe that the first party that takes this on is going to start winning elections and never stop losing. And when Donald Trump first came out as a Republican candidate for president with a 25% popularity rating, it was on a single issue, and that was his 25% tax on imported Chinese goods. And then he went off on the birther crazy train and kind of collapsed. But I mean, this is an issue that has potency. Anyhow, let's get to your book, your current book. This Suicide of a Superpower, Will America Survive to 2025? Let me read you a quote that I believe is from your book. And you wrote, the majority of immigrants and illegals come from third world countries and do not bring the academic or professional skills of European Americans. That'd be white Americans. The decline in academic test scores here at home and in international competition is likely to continue as more and more of the children taking those tests will be African American and Hispanic. First of all, do you stand behind that?
Well, yeah. As you know, the racial gap in test scores was discovered or was learned about or became a problem back in the 60s when I knew James Coleman of the Coleman Report. And we have invested something like 40 years, and I think trillions of dollars trying to close it. I mean, the Mayor Bloomberg and others in New York, and we find out that it has not been closed.
No, well, it's the consequence of 500 years of slavery, exploitation, and ongoing discrimination and prejudice. But here's the thing: you're an Irish American, Pat.
Right.
You have to know this history. I mean, I used to have a copy of one of the book published back in the think it was the 1870s, as I recall, called The Irish Gene. You're familiar with that book? Where they were speculating about, all these Irish immigrants came over here after the potato famine in the 1840s, and there was a huge wave of immigration in the 1840s, and then again in the 1860s from Ireland, and they were criminals, and they were living in ghettos on the East Coast, and and there was all this speculation that the Irish had to be genetically inferior, they had to be genetically criminals, and it took a couple of generations, literally generations, for those people, for your people, for the Irish people to be absorbed. And then in the 1880s and 1890s, we saw the same thing with the Italians coming over here. And in the turn of the century, there was all this speculation about what's wrong with the Italians. And they formed these kind of little communities and eventually the mafia. And now Italians aren't viewed as being deficient or whatever. I mean, it takes time for minority groups to get up to speed.
Well, I agree with that, but I will say this: my friend Pat Moynihan, who was with me in the Nixon White House when they were talking about these education policies with James Coleman, he said, back in the 1920s and 30s, he said it was impossible to find a Jewish school, no matter how bad its conditions, that failed. In other words, the kids came to school with certain attitudes about education and interest, whatever it was, and they succeeded. By the time the 30s were over, they were trying to use quotas to keep them out of Harvard. So let me say this:
it's the immigrant. That's the immigrant syndrome.
All right, but you spoke for a while there, Tom.
Sure.
Let me speak here. What I'm saying is that for 45 years we've been unable to close the gap, and in the international test scores, because of the fact that more and more Hispanics and African Americans are taking those tests, whatever the cause. I mean, let's assume you're right on the cause. That is the reason why the international test scores, I believe, are falling and the United States is failing. A friend of mine down at the Heritage Foundation studied the test scores, and he found, for example, that white Americans did better than all the Europeans except Finns. Asian Americans did better than all the Asians except for the Chinese in Shanghai. African Americans did better than any black country, and Hispanic Americans did better than any Latin American country. But the gaps there still existed worldwide between those countries and ours. But in any event, my point is simply this, that maybe you're right, and that'll be a wonderful thing, but right now, the test scores in these communities, we've never been able to end that gap, and the possibility exists that you may be right, but it may be
Pat,
3 and 4 generations before we ever do.
Well, of course,
if we ever do.
It took 4 generations for the Irish to assimilate. It took 4 generations for the Italians to assimilate.
Not 4. Are you kidding?
Yeah, no, I'm not kidding. I mean, look at you. You still had. In fact, the reason there's still so many Irish cops in Boston was that was basically the only job available to them up until the 1930s.
Also because they wouldn't let them hire anybody else.
That's part of my point. I mean, it took a while, but we only have a minute left. And Pat Buchanan, a lot of people are taking what you're saying as code for inferior genes. Yeah. Please tell me that's not what you're talking about.
Well, don't know anything about genetics or something like that. What I'm saying is these are the test scores, and we haven't been able to.
So do you disavow that?
Pardon?
Do you disavow that idea? That
well, I don't know anything about. I mean, look, the Coleman report.
I mean, you're being quoted on
the Coleman report, and I think I got in my book. The Coleman report said what a child brings to school is far more important than what he finds in schools. In other words, heredity and home environment, nature and nurture. Do I know the differences or what percentages or this and that? Of course not. I'm not going to get into that. I'm saying is, here's the test scores now, and this is the problem. And as in our future, quite frankly, Hispanic Americans and African Americans, because of test scores, because the dropout rate is 50%, they're going to be in the service economy, and the rest of us are going to be up there in the knowledge industry, and that doesn't make for a united America. And I'm surprised as a liberal, that you wouldn't at least view these arguments.
I want to do more about it. But Pat, we're out of time.
Okay.
Pat, Buchanan.org, the website, Pat Buchanan, his new book.
Let's do it again, Tom.
Okay.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
His new book, Suicide of a Superpower, Will America Survive the 2025? We'll be back.